podcast where we try to take the events that are happening in our world and put them into a larger historical or theoretical context. Um, Last week, we had on Brett Devereaux, an ancient Roman historian, to talk about ancient Roman constitutional crises because it feels very much like we're in the middle of a constitutional crisis. So this week, I'm very excited to have on someone who has spent a lot of time thinking about American history and the history of the American Constitution and the kind of crisis that we are in today. So I'm excited to welcome Jamelle Bouie, New York Times columnist, to the podcast.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you on. Um, so I guess my first question for you is, if you had to give a summary of the crisis that we're in, what's happening today? What kind of a crisis are we facing?
So, to step away from the Constitution for a second, I think that the immediate political crisis is that we have a chief executive who wants to transition the United States into some kind of autocratic system. It seems like the vision they have in their heads is sort of a populist autocracy where elections are no longer sort of essentially custodial mechanisms for deciding who happens to be leading the government, but transfer sovereignty from the electorate to the president, who then governs as basically a despot, with no practical limits on their authority. That's the crisis that we have. We have like a would be Caesar, um, who can utilize the accumulated powers of the executive to attempt to instantiate this vision of the presidency.
Yeah, I think that's right. And some of them will kind of come out and say this. There's an essay from Russell Vought, who's currently in the administration. I've mentioned this on the podcast before, called, I believe, "Renewing American Purpose."
Right.
Um, right, where he talks about this idea of radical constitutionalism, that the constitutional order he thinks, in some sense, is broken, and his idea is that we need a charismatic, populist, authoritarian president. In his words, who engages in like great struggles with Congress over the future of American policy.
Can I just say that one of the strangest things about this type of argument, which Vaught makes it. I mean, a bunch of these guys make it. That we have to have this restoration of the old constitutional order, and then you like actually read about, say, American politics in the 1820s, and what you have is a strikingly weak president and an extraordinarily powerful Congress, right? Like in a real, even Andrew Jackson, condemned as a king, as a tyrant, in a real sense, was the first president who was actually co-equal with the Congress in terms of the amount of power he was attempting to exercise. And I just find it sort of strange that they have this vision of the American past where the presidency and presidents were like striding across American society, acting like kings, when in a lot of ways the president was like very much a sideshow, a subordinate figure, right? Like there's a reason why we I'll put it this way: 100 years from now, maybe the only legislator people are going to remember from this period, favorably, I'll say, is Nancy Pelosi. You know, maybe Ted Kennedy because he's a Kennedy, but like we remember Henry Clay and Daniel Webster and even John C. Calhoun. We remember these people precisely because they were incredibly powerful lawmakers who could challenge the White House in their own right for influence. And so it's like if you're thinking let's restore the constitutional order, the constitutional order that you're trying to you would want to restore is one where the president basically is just like a chief magistrate, is a custodial figure, and Congress really does run the show. And their vision of a presidency that is an elected monarch just has no grounding in American history. Like it's just not a thing that's ever existed in this country.
No, I think that's right. I think it's striking. I mean, this is a theme I want to come back to. Is the atrophy of Congress and the atrophy of Congress as an active force in our government, and how that's connected to the crisis that we're in and how we got here. I'm also struck, like you say, by reading these conservatives and how they'll start with some very, very high-minded rhetoric, but then their historical examples are often ill chosen and their analysis is often incoherent, right? Because in this essay, Vaught puts forth this vision of a charismatic authoritarian president struggling with a Congress, and then his complaints about why the system is broken is that Congress stymied his policy agenda in the first term, right? And
Right.
and so it's the kind of incoherence that I don't really know how to resolve.
I mean, to my mind, it reflects not so much like an understanding of the constitutional order, but sort of Vaught's understanding in this and the MAGA rights understanding, the new rights understanding of Trump and of political power. Right, they have fully internalized the idea that there is an authentic American people that is not coterminous with the actual American people, just like a subset of the American public that is an authentic people. This authentic people has essentially invested itself into Trump, who is their tribune, and that by virtue of winning an election, Trump was then entitled, as the tribune of this authentic American people, to do whatever he wants. That there's no legitimate opposition to what Trump wants to do from other instruments of the government because he is the authentic representative of the authentic American people. And I think that's the only real way you can sort of like square this up, because if you take a more liberal view, not like American Democratic Party politics, but sort of like liberal in the sense of liberal currents. um if you take a more liberal view, then it's like, no, well, there is no authentic American people. The American people are the American people. They're all politically equal. Trump is a constitutionally bounded executive who, although can make claims when he wants to attempt to further his agenda, he can say, I was elected to do this thing, and therefore the people in Congress should, to honor the fact that the American people elected me, go along with my agenda. He can make those claims, certainly, but Congress has every right as a co-equal branch of government, elected, right? Each member of Congress elected by people who are also the American people, elected to represent their more particular interests. Congress can say no, and that's how the system works. That's how it's always worked. But the I think the underlying premise of a Vought, of a Michael Anton, of all those guys, is that the there's an authentic people that Trump is the like living avatar of, and that basically imbues him with sovereign power. It makes him something like a king, and you can't resist the king, not legitimately.
Yeah, so I think you see this language getting more explicit, right? If you read some of the stuff that's coming out of the Claremont Institute, when they talk about we have to abandon the Constitution in order to save the Constitution.
Right.
And again, that's a kind of an incoherent understanding. Like, how does that even work? Unless you add on, well, what the Constitution really is, the fundamental, the old law, that predates the Stone Table, is this is a white man's republic,
Yeah.
and everything else is just set dressing, and that's what they're trying to get back to.
Right. The way in which they've gotten explicit is, I mean, helpful, right, for those of us who have been saying, they're kind of just pining for a white man's republic. But it's also quite disturbing because I'll say I don't think that there are many people in like the professional commentary class, of which I am a member, who really take that stuff seriously. But like they should. They should take it very seriously.
It's clear that the Trump administration takes it seriously, and the rest of us are whistling past the graveyard if we don't. Yeah, and I'm struck also. There's the white man's republic aspect of it, but it's not even a republic they seem to want, right? This is sort of what you've been talking about, is the sense of Trump as a king, right? That
Yeah.
he's like these little AI images of himself with a crown on. But you might say that's not even a king necessarily that they want. There's a German phrase that encapsulates this idea more clearly, the Führerprinzip,
Right.
um, right? Which is that it's that we have the man who, in some ways, embodies the people, right? And he doesn't need to respond to them in a democratic way. He just, like, through his gut connection with the blood and the soil, knows what's best for everyone, and he can declare one law is valid and the other law is invalid, and there's a state of exception that means that all whatever laws he doesn't like, get to be tossed aside.
That's precisely where they are going with this. And it's helpful. I mean, it's helpful to, okay, to pull back a little bit. So people will observe, right, that there are multiple competing strains within kind of like the whole movement. There is the Claremont sort of like, we have to destroy the Constitution to save the American Republic, which is explicitly conceived as a white man's republic. There's sort of like the Christian nationalists. We have to establish basically a Christian dictatorship to preserve or restore our cultural dominance. And then there is sort of, I guess you can call them more traditional conservatives, but like Republican partisans who are aligned fully with the administration. And what kind of unites all of them, not what unites all of them, but what allows Trump to be a bit of a tribune for all of them, is that there already is this sort of pre-existing set of legal theories about the nature of the presidency, that the unitary executive. Which I gotta say, just as like a side commentary, I kind of hate talking about the unitary executive because it sounds so weirdly conspiratorial. It's like, yeah, for 40 years, the top minds in the conservative legal movement have been like theorizing how you can make a president a king. And it's like, that sounds kind of crazy, but it's also like literally true. um, but the useful thing about the contract of the unitary executive is it sort of has everything for all these different groups, right? Like, it enables the presidency or a president that they are aligned with to pursue all of their interest under the guise of, well, I'm just restoring the presidency to its rightful amount of authority, which is not true, but is very useful. And so, on the Claremont side, the president just issued an executive order yesterday that was like, we have to restore proper American history in the Smithsonian, which also seemed to endorse race science. Um, but it was, he can make these claims to try to influence the culture along the lines that I think Claremonters like. And if someone like me says, well, the president doesn't have any authority over the Smithsonian board, this is just like a glorified blog post, he can say, well, under my authority vested in me by Article 2, I control the entire executive branch directly. And so, Smithsonian's statutory separation from my control is unconstitutional, and I can claim it. Partisan Republicans and conservative legal folks will like clap like braying seals because they like this. And Christian nationalists likewise will say, oh, I can use that kind of claims to authority to pursue, removing transgender people from the military. So it's a nice little theoretical formula that satisfies everyone.
Yeah, I mean, I think this gets to something that we've written about a number of times at Liberal Currents, talked about here on the podcast, and is that's the role of personalism in the Trump system, right? That a personalist system isn't one that's proceeding according to laws and like carefully promulgated policies, and everybody knows which direction the ship is heading. But a personalist system is where you have usually one guy at the top and then a bunch of competing factions underneath him who are not necessarily aligned with each other as closely as you might think. And they are all working towards the president, to get their policy through. And we've seen some of this in the leaked signal chats. The extent to which Trump appears just kind of checked out,
Yeah.
and he's not really in here making decisions, and it's just a question of like which among the courtiers can most claim to speak for him at a given time. And I think that helps unite these different factions, is that they think if they can invest Trump with all the powers of the king, then they, as like significant courtiers in the court can get a little bit of their policy, desired policy outcomes out of that.
Right, that's right. By maintaining their proximity to Trump, maintaining his favor, then they can, you're right, they can get their preferred policy outcomes out of it. They don't have to deal with the messiness in their minds of negotiating with Congress or making a, reaching out to the public or any of that. They can just have a direct line to the president, and if you don't have a direct line to the president, then I guess you're shit out of luck. One of the striking things, I mean, to me, just along these lines, is to watch members of Congress, right, like kind of grovel to the administration to protect programs from Elon Musk, right? Like just sort of, even if they haven't officially done it, like essentially have sacrificed or given up their claim to being a co-equal branch that controls spending, and says, yeah, yeah, well, the president, King Trump, he is the one who controls spending. And so if I want something for my district, I have no power as a member of Congress to obtain it. I have to just go to Trump and beg for his favor. I mean, it's so un-American. It's
It's
it,
profoundly un-American.
it's like a, just like a, it's and I know these people don't care about that, but I just, it's so striking to me. Like if you found yourself in that position, you're a senator, U.S. senator, and you're like begging Stephen Miller to protect some appropriations. It's like, what are you doing? What are you doing?
Yeah, I mean, like, you want to yell at these people, like, have some self-respect, or like, don't you understand what our ancestors fought and died for in this country? It's among like the most central premises is that we don't have a king in
Right.
America.
And I'll say what's striking about some of the public response to this is like often their constituents are saying this to them as well, right? They're saying at these town halls, like, "What are you doing? Like, just we elected you to do things for us, not to beg and grovel
Hmm.
uh, to to anyone, and certainly not Elon Musk, who wasn't even, he's just a guy."
Yeah, it turns out he's just a guy. So yeah, I mean, I think this suggests how what we're watching is an attempt to transform the constitutional order without necessarily rewriting the Constitution, right? But you have this legal theory of the unitary executive that means absolute control over the entire federal bureaucracy devolves onto Trump. And this is a way for many different factions to all try and get their little bit of bigotry, their little bit of policy agenda out of the administration without having to go through Congress, right? That this is going to, in functional ways, kind of turn the constitutional system upside down. Um, and this is the point where I want to take a little bit of a step back, um, and from the shape of the present crisis, and talk more about like what is when we what is the Constitution in America beyond the words on paper? What is the constitutional order? How has it changed over time? Um, and initially, I was going to ask you to just like talk about every constitutional order from the colonial era to now, and then I realized we would be here all week, or possibly all semester. So I'm gonna, unfortunately, much as I would love to, I'm gonna ask you to pick one. Right?
Yeah.
What's an era of American history that represents a kind of a coherent constitutional order, and how did it work?
So let's talk about the antebellum period. So the years between the War of 1812, and really, I mean, really the years between 1820 and then 1854, 1857. Let's say Dred Scott is what, 1857. So let's say Dred Scott. Let's say the years between McCulloch v. Maryland and Dred Scott, which I think you can really think of as like a coherent and distinct constitutional order, it's the distinct visions of what federalism was in the United States, not so much a competing federal power or state power, but kind of a complementary. There are realms where federal power dictates. There are realms where state power is in control. There are realms when both have some overlapping responsibilities, and the question is one where one party's responsibility begins and the other party's responsibility ends. So it's a kind of a different conception of federalism than what we have, which is very kind of like hierarchical. Like it's a question of who has ultimate authority versus this is something a little more malleable, a little more flexible. there is the political settlement over slavery, which kind of coheres into something like a constitutional settlement, like part of the part of the radicalism of the Second Fugitive Slave Act in 1850 and of the Dred Scott ruling in 1857 was that many Americans understood it as actually and of the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854, is that all these things represented to many Americans a radical rejection, overturning of what they assumed was a settled part of the American political constitutional order, and that essentially was, like, you can call it, I guess, like sectionalism, right? The South exists below this geographic line. Slavery is allowed to exist below that line, no questions. And the North exists above that line, and slavery is outlawed above that line. And we make sure that we balance the two sides as best as possible to maintain something like equitable representation of slave owners and non-slave owners in the Congress. The I mentioned earlier, the kind of the triumvirate of Daniel Webster, Henry Clay, and John C. Calhoun, all people who entered Congress around the same time as what was called it was called War Republicans, something like that, War Hawks, something. Not, I don't think it was War Hawks. It was something. It was War something. They were basically advocates for the War of 1812, and they come into authority as like important Congress people in the 1820s and the 1830s, and they kind of represent this sort of cohered um, constitutional order, and those were sort of the basics, right? Like its domestic agenda is mostly trying to establish a unified system of commerce within the country, expand American borders, remove under Jackson and Van Buren, remove the presence of Native Americans in the lands that Americans wanted, kind of maintain this detente around slavery, and really try to keep slavery as much off of the national agenda as possible in favor of um, uh, kind of preserving a constitutional order that allowed for growth, that allowed for expansion, and that allowed for a good amount of autonomy amongst each of the states. And that begins to fracture and collapse in the 1850s and finally collapses for good with the secession crisis in 1860 and 1861 and the Civil War. But I think you can think of that as like a coherent constitutional order. And critically, it's not one based off of a change to the formal constitution, right? There is no constitutional amendment happening in this process. The last constitutional amendment, that the previous one, is the 12th Amendment in 1801, 1802, which adjusts the electoral college. So there's the Constitution has not been amended. The Supreme Court is issuing rulings that are both clarifying its authority in relation to the rest of the political system. Obviously, everyone knows Marbury v. Madison, um, uh, but there are many others. I've mentioned McCulloch v. Maryland, which really just established sort of federal supremacy, at least in some areas. Um, uh, but there are these various cases, dealing with questions of federalism, dealing with questions of what's the relationship between the Supreme Court and the state courts, like all of this kind of trying to work everything out um, uh, in the service of a more unified kind of like national political culture and unified national legal culture. Uh, and then you have these political settlements, the Missouri Compromise, especially in 1820, 1821, and then the fallout from the nullification crisis in 1830 and 1831, which kind of set out the basic rules of this order, right? Like slavery exists here and here, and you can't nullify the federal government, and those are the rules. Um, and when things begin to break down, it's because all of a sudden, hey, is slavery really going to stay here? And oh, can we nullify things? I will add as well that it's kind of funny to me in a dark way that there's there's this modern day view that's discredited, but people still hold it. The Civil War wasn't necessarily about slavery, that there are these other issues at work. And then you actually, you look at the timeline, and basically every 10 years there's like a major political crisis over slavery. um and it's like, yeah, they were gonna start shooting each other over this eventually. Like it's kind of, you can see it, very quickly. Every decade there is something that is driving the country to complete fracture, and it's slavery, and it was going to happen It's going to happen eventually. That's why they call it the impending crisis.
Yeah, I mean, I think could talk a lot about the whole lost cause mythology and how that kind of required writing slavery out of history. But for the moment, I do kind of want to ask this question, right? Is that we have this constitutional order, right? We have a kind of a settlement. It's often phrased, right, where you've talked about sectionalism, you've talked about federalism, you've talked about expansion, and this holds together for a while. Um, why does it all collapse? Why does it explode?
Yeah, well, it explodes for not any number of reasons, but for a variety of reasons. Some of this is just the changing political economy in the United States. As so at the beginning of the 19th century, slavery is lucrative, but it's not the kind of industry that it essentially becomes in the 1830s and 40s. And slave owners themselves are becoming fabulously wealthy. Internal migration, quote unquote natural increase among enslaved people, is also uh, giving them much more representation in Congress. And so, as the economy of slavery grows, as goes national, as it links the South to the North through financial instruments, to Great Britain and through exports, to France through exports, as it basically becomes this node connecting the United States to the entire Atlantic world. All that, one side effect is that it also gives slave owners so much more political power within the American government. And so slave owners are beginning to really feel themselves. They're really beginning to ask, especially this generation in the 1840s and 1850s, who are the children of someone like Calhoun, pro-slavery ideologue, kind of intellectual father of nullification, like all these things, but also a unionist at heart, and not someone who was supportive of secession, who believed in the Union. But his not his literal children, but the people who followed him were much more radical in the sense that they were asking, "We are so powerful. Why do we even need Why do we need the North?" So you have the changing economy of slavery, um, transforming the politics of slavery, as at least for the slaveholders. At the same time, you have immigration to the United States, immigration to the North, um, northern populations growing considerably, but that's not necessarily translating into more political power, which itself is making people antsy and angry, but also leading to this additional question, which is, well, we have all these people, we need land. We need land for these people to be able to work. We need land for these people to be able to establish themselves, and be able to go west and get more land. And the slave South also wants to go west and get more land to expand slavery. So we have this conflict over just who gets to claim the land, who gets to lay ownership. Is it going to be the slave South, so they can expand slave production, or is it going to be the non-slave North? I'm not going to say free North. That's the language we use, but like free, yeah, strong word. The non-slave North, which wants to reserve that for freeholders, for people who are going from the east, to the west. As all of this is happening, and kind of in part as a result of the growing economic strength of slavery and political power of slavery, you have like a reinvigorated anti-slavery movement. You have the emergence of radical abolitionists who aren't just calling for gradual emancipation, who reject colonization being a somewhat popular quote unquote solution in the early parts of the 19th century, but who are saying, we need to immediately end slavery. And as part of their argument, their claim, they are really relying on the testimony, the experiences of formerly enslaved people themselves who have escaped. And one thing I think is worth noting in all of this is that the rate of escape for enslaved people is something like a couple thousand people a year, which in contemporary United States doesn't seem like much, but if you just adjust for population, you're talking 20, 30, 40, 50,000 people a year fleeing north, fleeing to Canada, and talking about their experiences as well, and also putting pressure on the South, which wants to suppress this. And in the effort to suppress this, is beginning to sort of violate the rights of other people, other Americans. So all these things are happening that are basically just ramping up the tension, and that begins the. I mean, this is kind of fast forwarding things, but that begins to produce like a deteriorating political situation. You know, Americans, anti-slavery Americans get so fed up that they start organizing in mainstream political parties. They start forming, running presidential candidates, electing people to Congress, really trying to, heighten the contradictions, you might say, of the slave system. Pro-slavery politicians respond to this as a provocation and get even more extreme. Opportunistic politicians like Stephen Douglas from Illinois are trying to enhance their own national standing and kind of ally themselves with the slaveholders to a certain extent, which itself produces things that they cannot control. I mentioned the Kansas Nebraska Act, which repeals the Missouri Compromise, establishes popular sovereignty as the basis for what territories are going to, whether they'll be free or slave. And Douglas thought of this as like kind of a genius. I will be able to I will be able to be an ally to the slave South, but I alienate myself too much to the Northern Democrats. And what ends up happening in actuality is it's like a spark
Yeah, he gives us
into
bleeding Kansas.
right. I think there's actually. I mean, I think Stephen Douglas, as a bit of an aside here, is an interesting figure precisely because he is so reminiscent of figures in our own politics who have no sense of like the broader forces at work and are acting purely opportunistically and make choices that end up, blowing up the entire thing. Roger Taney on the Supreme Court is a similar figure. Dred Scott is him trying to basically settle the issue for good. Slavery's been so divisive, it's been so destructive, it's threatening the integrity of the Union. So I'm going to settle the constitutional question, and hopefully that can get us back to business. That can bring us back to the old order. That can restore it. When in reality, it more fuel on the fire. And he was too arrogant, too blinkered to really recognize that would be the case. Sounds familiar.
Ever so slightly familiar somehow.
but to answer, I mean, to kind of to wrap up my answer to your question, like the political order or the constitutional order that emerges here in the 1820s is sort of brought down by its own contradictions, and I think you can say the same about our constitutional order, which does contain these profound contradictions. And I think the most important one, what does it how does one have a representative Republican government, lowercase r, with a chief executive who has accumulated immense amounts of power and authority and autonomy? It's coming to a head. Like, the one way to resolve the contradiction is say, well, you don't actually have a republic.
Yeah, so I think there's so much that we can kind of learn from this picture of the antebellum South about what constitutional orders are. Um, and so one distinction I want to start with is between the capital C Constitution, the text of the Constitution, and the Constitution as interpreted or as practiced. Right, because I mean, a lot of people when they hear constitutional order, they think it's just a matter of the black letter text of the Constitution, but it isn't. Right, as you were talking about, both we have these various Supreme Court cases that are kind of clarifying different parts of the Constitution, or we just have, gentlemen's agreements about how the Constitution is going to be applied in practice. Like you were talking about these settlements about federalism, about sectionalism, right? That there are certain things that we're not going to touch, so to speak, that form an important structure for what the Constitution, how it actually works in practice. So that's certainly something I want to keep in mind. One thing I'm also very struck by is how much this goes beyond the law,
Yeah.
right? Legal scholars have this kind of hyperfixation on changes in the law, and that's understandable. That's their profession. But and this is very much what I was again talking about last week with Brett Devereaux, was how changes in the economic structure of ancient Rome created problems that the political structure was not able to cope with. And right, you can see in the antebellum South the way that there's this interlocking system of economics and politics and law and territorial expansion that all together kind of needs to cohere enough to create a constitutional settlement. And when they stop cohering, right, you can declare, like you can have, like you were saying, Taney can declare the law to be what he wants it to be, but that doesn't fix the underlying political economic imbalances.
Right, right. So to jump back to the antebellum constitutional political order, like part of what is sustaining it, as we've discussed, is not necessarily the exact text of the Constitution, which is quite flexible enough to allow for all kinds of different configurations of institutional and political power. Like there are many different. It's broad enough. It gives the national government enough power to you can, as we've seen throughout American history, you can have many different constitutional configurations of the American political system. But that order is hanging on a set of, for lack of a better term, like norms about kind of the proper scope of political contestation. Like the fundamental norm is that we're just really not going to argue over slavery. We're going to try as much as possible to keep slavery off of the table. And we're going to exercise restraint when it comes to what our preferred outcomes might be with slavery. Sure, you're a slave owner and you think slavery is great. You think it's a positive good, but you have a higher value, the union, and that's gonna bound and restrict how you advocate for your interests as a slaveholder. And maybe you are an abolitionist. Maybe you want to see slavery completely extirpated from the United States. But again, you have this higher commitment to the union, and you're willing to make compromises along those lines to preserve the union, even if it means slavery survives elsewhere. And in the same way, I would say that in kind of the post Second World War, and especially post civil rights political order in the United States, which I think you can describe as a constitutional order, there were supposed to be these larger values, right? In a lot of ways, the civil rights movement and the civil rights laws, even though they are based on kind of just more um, aggressive enforcement of the 14th and 15th Amendments, especially, do kind of constitutionalize this notion that the US is a multiracial democracy, that it is, we strive for genuine pluralism, and that you can debate all kinds of things, you can make all kinds of claims, you can do all that kind of stuff, but we're not going to break our commitment to that thing. That's sort of the thing that's a bit off the table, so to speak. The actual nature of who the American people are. We settled it, and we've constitutionalized it, and we're informally, and we're going to leave it there. And it's in this current moment. I mean, given the ideological commitments of the MAGA right? Like it shouldn't be a surprise that among the first things they start going after are desegregation orders from the 1960s. Is quote unquote DEI, which is really kind of any attempt to integrate the government, integrate private sector industries. The Civil Rights Act of 1964. I mean, clearly, they have Brown v. Board on the mind, right? Sort of, they're going after the things that did create this constitutional settlement, in the hopes of uh, establishing a new one that doesn't take those things for granted. But those things, again, that are what's holding it together, is really just a set of norms, like an agreement, right? That in the 2008 election, when Barack Obama was running for president, John McCain isn't gonna run, a viciously racist hate campaign against Obama. Um, I don't think McCain would, but it's noteworthy that like Republicans didn't nominate someone who would, right? Like it was sort of an unspoken thing, right? Like we're going to argue about our visions for the country. We might even accuse Obama of palling around with terrorists. Like we're going to maybe inch up to the line, but we're not going to break this informal rule. I, I'll put it this way. One of to me remains one of the funniest things that's ever happened in recent American politics is when George W. Bush was doing the book tour for his book, hard decisions, or decision choices, whatever it was called, something like that. It wasn't decision choices.
The decider. I kind of wish it was decision choices.
Decision choices would be a very funny title, and I do also wish that's what it was called. But he was doing an interview like on 60 Minutes or something, and he was asked, what was the moment in your presidency that gave you the most, hurt you the most? And George W. Bush, who launched the Iraq War, tortured people, a world historical catastrophe for the United States and the rest of the globe. George W. Bush says, when Kanye West called me a racist, and he was like tears in his eyes. He
Yeah.
was he was so deeply hurt by this. And it's funny, but also I think it illustrates what I mean when I say that there were these moments that were binding the political actors, right? Like George W. Bush,
He meant it.
he
Right?
meant
He
it. He
wasn't
really
kidding.
meant it. He George W. Bush believed in the notion of like a multiracial country. Um, uh, for whatever that's worth, but he did really believe in it, and that's the norm that has been jettisoned. And interestingly, like with it, I mean, the thing about American history is that so much of you can't easily separate, right, sort of the story of racial inclusion in the US from things like the growth of the administrative state, the growth of the welfare state, because they are tied together. Even the growth of the national security state, they're all tied together, right? Like part of the even during the New Deal, part of what was necessary when it comes to growing out the administrative state is just like how are you going to administer all these programs to all these people? And if you're going to administer all these programs to all these people and you're going to start including more people, well, what about this excluded group of people? And it kind of just it lends naturally. During the Great Society, oh, we've included all these people. We actually need more people and programs on the administrative side to make sure that they're actually included. And to its, I wouldn't say to its credit, but like the MAGA right, like clearly understands this, clearly sees that all these things are tied up together, and that an attack on a pluralistic racial order kind of necessitates an attack on the administrative state, necessitates attack on the social insurance state, because all those things are kind of they're emerging in tandem with each other, and they're connected to each other.
No, I think that's exactly right, and I think this really does bring us back to the present crisis. And so here I'm going to formulate a real question this time. What do you think the cause of our present crisis is? Right, we had, like you say, a kind of a constitutional settlement, post civil rights. It's clearly cracked apart and is in some ways or another isn't working. What brought us here? Right, what are the roots of this constitutional crisis? Right, because there's a lot of theories out there, right? Some people will say it's wealth inequality and it's the growth of the 1% versus the 99%, and that's the most fundamental crisis. And other people will say it's a kind of a legal crisis, that we have an overgrowth of vetocracy that has created federal sclerosis, and that's leading us in other directions. There are all kinds of theories out here.
Yeah.
What's your pitch on what brought us here?
I mean, in the same way that the collapse of the antebellum political and constitutional order had multiple different causes, many things were happening. I think it's similar here, right? There is the political economy story, right? Like, and really, yeah, the political economy story, which is the first decade of the 2000s, saw stagnant wage growth and growing inequality that you know culminated in a catastrophic recession that took another decade to recover from, so almost like 20 years of either underwhelming or outright lost growth. 20 years of economic stagnation for many people, in addition to any number of policy disasters from the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War to the things that produced the Great Recession, to what produced the recovery, to, I think, obviously disagree with this, but to many Americans, sort of the growth in immigration, which is in a lot of ways a product of economic performance in the region. So you have that part of it, right? Like you basically a bunch of people, a lot of Americans who have grown incredibly skeptical of the government's ability to really manage anything. And then you have the profound gridlock of the American government over the last decade. I mean, the years of 2010 to 2020, where the government, Congress, just couldn't do anything, couldn't really address the nation's problems in a single comprehensive way, relied on stopgaps and half measures to do anything. And this is a product of like particular choices of like your partisan antagonists, like it's Mitch McConnell, it's Senate Republicans, it's John Boehner, it's the Tea Party, it's these groups and individuals making political choices about how they're best going to achieve power, but the product is kind of grinding American government to the halt. So at the same time, they have disenchantment with just like the state of things. You also have a government that very visibly cannot actually do much, do much to improve the situation. You have rapid cultural changes. And this goes back even further, right? Like this is you have, even though we have the formal integration of institutions in the 60s, it's not really until the 1990s that like we were getting like serious and meaningful cultural and social integration in the United States, where the notion of the US as this pluralistic multicultural country really takes off, and with it the beginnings of political opposition to it. I'm thinking of Pat Buchanan in 92,
Right. Like, I
among
mean,
others.
just on a personal level, right? I'm trans, and like the level of cultural change on that issue in my lifetime is extraordinary.
Yes. So cultural change in terms of race, cultural change in terms of gender and sexuality, happening rapidly over the course of 20 or 30 years. And I actually think that this would have all kind of muddled along probably fine, although there's a chance that it probably would have culminated into something like the present moment eventually. But I think that things would have muddled along for a bit. But I do think Trump ends up being this catalyst for an explosion and a real confrontation, both because Trump, especially, I mean, not especially, but in that first campaign, really was the tribune of we got to take it back, right? Like all these changes are unacceptable. We have to roll back the clock to a less open, a less multicultural society. And then there's the reaction to Trump, which is like this furious sort of assertion of no, we like the way things are. We like the way American society has become. And the 2020 protests are this like shining example of how the culture really has changed in just profound ways. And obviously, to the right, this is all the product of nefarious conspiracies. This is, and when I say the right here, I don't even mean the MAGA right. I mean even the center right, who see this as the work of Maoist cadres at our universities, of cancel culture, of all these things. But what's actually happening, like if you aren't a moron, is that there have been underneath the surface profound cultural changes in how Americans understood themselves, understood their country. Integration worked. It worked to change people's attitudes in meaningful ways. And so when you have these George Floyd protests, first you have this police killing, which itself, there's been almost at that point like a half decade of organizing and mobilizing around this, and persuasion. And so you have this police killing that sparks these protests, not sparks, but it drives organizers to begin turning people out to protest. And the protests aren't just a bunch of black people or Hispanic people, but it's a broad cross section of American society, protesting the killing of this man and making demands about how they want to see transformation in American society. And I think for conservatives, for the right, they they understood this as being revolutionary, right? They understood this as being the beginnings of a full-on overturning and destruction of final destruction of the old ways, of the old kind of cultural settlement, you might say. Uh and I really think that that's sort of the catalyst for the current crisis. The response to this from the right was, we have to do everything in our power to prevent this from ever happening again, which in effect means rolling back the years 1964, really 1954 to 2008.
Yeah, I think that's right. Again, if you look at what these people write, it's clear that the culture is just scaring the pants off them, right? Even more than constitutional changes or political changes or the welfare state, it's the sense that the culture has turned against them terrifies them.
Yeah.
And I think it's helpful to see the kind of constitutional settlement they're trying to create as responding to all of the problems that you've described. Right, that on the cultural front, they have a program, right? Where they think that it's all woke indoctrination, and so they're going to destroy all the institutions of woke indoctrination that they can find, like universities, for example. Right, they're going to try and, like, it's like the NPC meme. They're going to try and replace the chip with, they're going to try and take out the woke mind virus and replace it with the conservative mind virus or something. Right. And on economic front, they're going to promise Americans that they're going to do something about the cost of living, and they have some kind of theory about how they want to transform the economy, but it's not clear that they understand anything. And there's a lot of,
Right.
they're just kind of lying about what they're going to do.
Well, they seem like they seem almost like transposing their cultural diagnosis onto the economy, right? Like it's sort of it's we have wokeness in the culture, but then also all these office jobs and stuff. Those are woke jobs, and we need to return to good, masculine manufacturing jobs. And even if we're poor, it'd be better for the American soul if you had more Americans, I don't know, like making T-shirts than
Steel,
producing,
probably steel is what they want. It's
right,
always more
steel,
steel.
knickknacks, than services.
Yeah. So I think this is, as we talked about last week, people tried to reform the constitution of ancient Rome, and they knew that there was something had gone horribly wrong in their society, and they were trying to fix it, and they just did not understand their society, and they did not understand how it worked, and so their reforms just don't fix anything and don't stick. And I think to some extent that's likely to happen with what we're seeing today, that these people don't understand what's driven these kinds of cultural changes, right? That it was not a conspiracy of Marxist professors that made people less racist. For example, right? I don't think they understand the economy and how it works, and this obsession with manufacturing jobs and how that connects with sexism and patriarchy is just kind of like a half remembered image of the 50s. So I guess my last question for you is, what's the alternative? Right?
Yeah.
If we can't just go back to the way things were, if we have to put something new in place ourselves, what can we work towards?
I mean, I know we're likely on the same page on this one. I mean, I think I continue to think that the great unfinished project of American society is just fully realizing the Reconstruction Amendments and fully realizing the aspirations of Reconstruction, which weren't simply, resolving the questions of the war, but really remaking American society into something much more egalitarian, much more inclusive. And although at the time they couldn't really conceive of something like the welfare state or the social insurance state or something like social democracy, I think that if you would have taken Thaddeus Stevens and Frederick Douglass and plopped them into the 1930s, they would have quickly sort of glommed on to like, yeah, this is what we want. This is the kind of uh, uh, federal support for ordinary people that we want. Um, uh, and if there's anything to strive towards, it is taking not just the literal Reconstruction Amendments, but sort of the Reconstruction ethos and trying to make it real, which would be taking seriously the 13th Amendment's commitment to bodily autonomy, taking seriously the 14th Amendment's commitment to genuine political equality and even social equality. We've never really figured out what the privileges and immunities of American citizenship mean, but they can mean a lot of things if we want them to mean that. And taking seriously the 15th Amendment's commitment to political and social inclusion. Wasn't forbidding discrimination and voting on the basis of race wasn't just a technical thing. It was an aspirational thing. It was saying that we're gonna, voting is the mark of citizenship. It's the mark of belonging, and we want to make sure that everyone has access to it, or everyone within, as we understand everyone to be, has access to it. So, I mean, it would be that, and it would be building on those things as well in kind of expansive ways. You mentioned the fact that the Rome tried to change its constitution, but they couldn't. They didn't understand what it was. The system they're trying to change, and what the system they had. I think we are in a somewhat similar situation. In addition to that, I would add there's sort of a belief that the American system is basically static, that it cannot be changed in any meaningful way, and that's, I think, part of what Trump does have on his side is this sort of, well, at least someone's doing something. At least someone's doing something to change things. Um, and I think the first step towards towards building something new and egalitarian. I'm not a big fan of the equity language. You may have noticed. I don't really use it. I'm gonna stick with egalitarian. I'm old fashioned that way. Um, try to build something more egalitarian is kind of persuading Americans that we are capable of changing the system in which we live, and changing it in ways that don't require some kind of like would be autocrat. That the Constitution can be made amendable, even if it is kind of unamendable in its current form. And that there are things we do need to amend, right? We do need to establish an absolute right to vote in the Constitution. We do need to restrict the powers of the presidency formally. We do need to establish an absolute right to bodily autonomy. Like we gotta do these things. But I do think it all comes back to sort of taking seriously this expansive vision that emerges out of the Civil War, which remains kind of the defining conflict of American society. Um, so many of our current questions, like I mean, who belongs? Who is an American? That's the question. And I
It's
wouldn't say the
just
Civil War was
one struggle, right back
right.
to the founding of the republic.
Um, and the Americans who fought the Civil War and who won it and who wanted to remake the society, they had an answer, and their answer was like everyone can be an American.
Yeah, yeah, they
Um,
put it right in the Constitution.
so I'm old fashioned in many ways, and one of the ways is that I think there is, for as much as they understand the impulse to want to sort of like say humbug to so much of America, the American past, I think that there's this line from Discourses, or this chapter in Discourses on Livy, where Machiavelli is like, the prince who wants to change his republic has to do so in terms of the old ways. And I think that's true. I think that's just true. And
Yes.
so part of building a new thing is going to be looking at the usable parts of our past and saying that is what we should be striving for. And elevating those things as, you know, as objects of veneration.
I think that's absolutely correct. Right, that there are. pieces of the American history, of the American Constitution, there are American aspirations to build a better country, a pluralist, inclusive country with a political and economic system that functions for all of us.
Right.
And I think we can look to the aspirations of the Reconstruction Amendments for, inspiration, guidance, a project. So yeah, thank you so much for coming on and talking about the crisis we're facing and maybe how we can start to see our way out of it. Um, as a reminder, Neon Liberalism is a listener-supported podcast. If you like what we do here, head on over to liberalcurrents.com and subscribe to our newsletter. And yeah, I will see you all again next week.